So I decided to spend a couple of days in Romania, which is over in Eastern Europe. It's almost a landlocked country, and I spent a day in Bucharest, the capital, which this video is about, and then I have another video about my time traveling outside of the capital, seeing the different castles in Transylvania. So, like lots of countries in Eastern Europe, Romania was a communist regime. It wasn't part of the USSR, but it did have this communist leader here. He was called Ceausescu, and after decades of rule, eventually there was a sort of revolution, and he and his wife were executed live on national TV on Christmas Day in 1989. So I arrived at my hotel and went out to explore the city centre. I love exploring these old communist countries, and the architecture around the city was really interesting. Ceausescu put up a huge amount of buildings for people to live in, and these are all still there, but in various stages of disrepair. One thing he did, which I think is fascinating, is if his plan for the city meant building over an old building, he literally had the buildings moved. So here's an example of a church that was moved, so these two big buildings either side could be built. So what they did, which is pretty clever, is put concrete underneath a building and then put these basically like rail tracks underneath and then just moved it along. So here's a church getting moved. You can see the clergymen not particularly happy about it, but they were lucky that they got to keep the church, I guess, because a lot of other communist regimes weren't that helpful towards the clergy and the church. Bucharest is actually on a fault line, so it does get earthquakes, and they're due every about 50, 60 years, and it's been that long since the last one. So a lot of these old communist buildings are actually quite dangerous because they weren't built particularly well and could easily fall down if there was an earthquake. This is actually an old corner shop from communist times, which would be the official, grocery store where you'd go and collect food. Towards the end of communism, there were a lot of food shortages because Ceausescu decided to sell off a lot of what was produced in the country in order to pay off the national debt. So I guess this was the sort of beginning of the end where people realized that communism perhaps wasn't for them. This is the government building where he gave his final speech, where the crowd sort of started to revolt against him, and he ended up leaving off the top of the building in a helicopter, was later captured and then taken to a quick trial. You can see the speech on YouTube. It's quite interesting. You see his face when he realizes the crowd's turned against him, and you can see that they took over that whole area after he'd gone. So Ceausescu was actually really inspired by North Korea. He visited them and he built Europe's biggest government building, modelled off North Korea ideas. It's absolutely massive and was made using effectively like slave labour, people forced to work there, and then all these apartments around it where the elite would live. It's 365,000 square meters and is the heaviest building in the world. So these are all the apartments that are around it. They kind of look quite ugly now, but I guess at the time they probably looked pretty fancy and desirable. Then running down from the palace, you have the Champs-Élysées style, really long road. And now next to the giant palace, they're building this really huge church for the Patriarchy of Romania. I understand this is quite controversial because it's obviously incredibly expensive, but most of the buildings in the city need, investment. I found it to be a real mix of the dilapidated old communist buildings, but then also the beautiful old buildings from before communism that also have sort of fallen into disrepair. And I understand because when communism came, all property was owned by the state. There was no private property, and there's now a lot of disputes around who owns everything. So people aren't looking after them because there's no owner for a lot of the buildings. This was the Novotel Hotel, which I thought was kind of cool. It had this old front, but then the glass behind. This was a really cool, like, hidden area. This was actually an old brothel. The ladies would be up there, and now it's just sort of empty. And, you know, if this was in London, they would make this into a really cool bar or something. I felt there was so much potential. There was this cool street with all these umbrellas on for your Instagram moment. I think normally this is filled with tourists. There's my pathetic attempt at an Instagram picture there. This was one of the prisons from during communism, the secret police, and it's now still a police station. I think it looked really scary. I think this is a monk residence that was also moved by the communists. And you can see examples here of like beautiful old buildings, and behind it you see that old dilapidated communist building, but people still living there. And my guide actually said that she has friends that go to sleep with a whistle and a flashlight in case there's an earthquake and the building collapses. Before communism, Bucharest was actually nicknamed Little Paris, or the Paris of the East, because a lot of their buildings were inspired by Parisian architecture. Architects came over from Paris to Bucharest. This was a beautiful nunnery right in the heart of town. It was just pristine, so peaceful, beautiful courtyard. And here you can see inside this little church they had beautiful frescoes, paintings, and it was literally right in the middle of town next to the sort of bars and different restaurants that were mainly geared up for British stag parties, I think. I thought the door was incredible. Look at the beautiful carvings outside. This was the outside of it, really small, tiny little church, and then the nuns have been. So one thing that really surprised me was kind of in the center of the city, on top of the only hill that's there, is this, which are the buildings of the Patriarchy, which is the organization, the institution that runs the Orthodox Church in Romania. The Patriarch is a gentleman who is the head of the church. This is where he lives. This is the main cathedral. Everything was beautifully restored, gold, beautiful, beautiful buildings, and really, really contrasted with the buildings out in the rest of the town, which were either these old communist ones or even older buildings, which were in desperate need of renovation. So it was a real juxtaposition. When I found it such an interesting city, there were plenty of different tours, and one of the tour guide gave me this list of recommendations which I wanted to share with you here. But that's it for Bucharest, so thanks so much for watching, and check out my other video which is being uploaded soon on the rest of Romania I visited. Bye!